Welcome to the Movement 2 as part of the Istanbul Innovation Days for 2021. This movement is centered around vibrations in the present, where we will speak to those who today are really rethinking fundamental societal relationships with technology. My name is Margun Indrebal Sheikh, and I'm the UNDP Deputy Resident Representative in Botswana, and I will be your moderator for this session. With me in this panel, I have four incredible individuals who will speak to us about their work and experiences in this space. You will hear from Sanjay Purohit, who's the Chief Curator of Societal Platform in India, who's challenging us to think very differently about scaling innovations and the role that technology can play in stewarding societal transformations. We will also hear from Honorable Minister of IT and Innovation in Rwanda, Paula Ingabire, about how Rwanda leveraged technology to really mount an impressive response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Then we will hear from Tomás Diaz, the Director of Fab Lab Barcelona at the Institute for Advanced Architecture, who's also the founder of Fab City Foundation in Estonia and Meaningful Design Group in Bali. And he will speak to us about how technology can really reshape and essentially democratize value production and bring resilience to citizens. And last but not least, we have Cahombo Stefano, founder and managing director of Green Dreams and Green Dreams Tech in Kenya. We will turn to Sanjay Purohit as our first discussant. And as I mentioned, Sanjay is the Chief Curator of Societal Platform. And he's here to talk to us about how technology can be an amplifier as opposed to a signal, and how societal platforms leverages technology to build better responses to crisis, to build agency, and to really distribute responsibility for these sort of societal transformations and the ambition of building resilient societies. So my first question to you, Sanjay, is, societal platforms has an incredibly ambitious goal to scale problem solving as opposed to solutions. And this at the moment when the platform model is really coming under increasing scrutiny globally. So how do you reconcile societal aims with a technology model like platforms in the context of a country like India?
So if we look at this question around the scrutiny around the platform model, I would place this as a question of intent. To illustrate this point, one could design a platform as a public good for societal development, or one could design the platform as a private venture for shareholder returns. One could design the platform that accrues value to society and to the co-creators, or one could design it such that it captures the value and accrues it to the owners and investors. It's possible to design it that a platform makes scarce resources abundant. You could also design it such that it captures scarce resources to increase competitive barriers. One could design a platform to nurture open and adjacent networks. One could design it to ensure that we create captive environments or increase the dependence on the platform. And lastly, one could design a platform such that it empowers the ecosystem with data, or one could design the platform that controls the ecosystem with data. The difference is not in technology, because technology is only a means, it's only a tool, it's only at our disposal. But the real question is, what is the intent? When we work at societal platform, to understand this very question, we root the intent in three fundamental core values: the core values of agency, the core values of dignity, and the core value of choice. And how do we architect, how do we design the platform, its ecosystems, the network effects, such that we improve agency or restore agency, such that we strengthen dignity of people and provide them the appropriate choices that they can exercise in their respective context. The problems we deal with are large, they're complex, they're dynamic, And so it is very useful to think about solutions or ways of solving these problems by leveraging platform thinking, but it has to be designed differently with the right intent so that the infrastructure that underlies these platforms, the innovations that thrive on this platform are inclusive and they allow for a larger good. And that is why we design them to be public goods rather than private resources.
Thank you very much, Sanjay. And I really like how you speak about this question of intent in design and how we need to be intentional about really creating value for all as opposed to value for a few, and that it's designed with that intent to empower and to share knowledge. So building a little bit on that, as you set out to tackle these sort of societal level missions, whether it's full financial inclusion or universal accessible education, and you leverage technology as an amplifier, what are some of the key design principles that drive your work?
Let me talk about three very fundamental design principles. One is, how do we design these societal platforms that create a unified but not a uniform environment? Let me give you a visual image of a plantation or a farm versus a rainforest. A farm is uniform. It thrives in standardization. It thrives in ensuring equal distance between each sapling and but a rainforest is different. It's unified, but it is not uniform. It's a nurturing ecosystem. So how do we design our intervention or our fundamental infrastructure to allow for unified response rather than uniform response is number one. And I'll give you some examples of this. Second important design principle is, one could design to distribute solutions, or one could design to distribute the ability to solve. Think about distributing, so to say, plastic injection molded toys, or distributing Lego bricks. And the whole idea is, how do you design such that we don't distribute pre-baked, preconceived, pre-proven solutions, but we distribute the ability to solve, because our beneficiaries have very varied contexts, socioeconomic context, environmental context, demographic context, political context. So it's important that the solution is assembled or prepared as late as possible and as close to context as possible, rather than prepared somewhere and then distributed. So that's a second important aspect, which is how do we distribute the ability to solve. The third is what we call as +1 thinking, or how do you make small changes at scale and do them again and again repetitively in an iterative way. So how do you design a platform to accomplish that? If you would see how children color with a crayon, how they color a rectangle, you would see that some of them might color it through vertical lines. Some of them might color it through horizontal lines. And some may just randomly color it and then fill wherever the white spaces are left. This is a very important design question. Do we solve all problems for few people, like 200 schools? Or we solve one problem for all schools? India has 1.5 million schools. So shall we solve one problem for all schools, or all problems for 2,000 schools? And so what we have learned in platform thinking is +1 to all schools. Shift the equilibrium, raise the tide, rather than doing these pilot replicate kind of thinking, because it is very hard to scale as context changes. So I would just leave it with these three fundamental design principles: unified, not uniform, distribute the ability to solve, and do +1 thinking, micro changes at scale. Let me give you examples. When we are working in urbanization, and in India, urbanization is a very important element. We currently have about more than 4,400 urban local bodies, and growing because it's a rapidly evolving economy. Now, the question is, each city, each urban local body, each town is different. Its context is different. Its culture is different. So one could create a model town and say all towns be like this. But with one of the platforms, which was built by e-government's foundation called Digit, the idea is to create a flexible infrastructure so that that platform can serve the needs for different types of cities, small cities, large cities, recent urbanization, late urbanization, or how far it is from nearest port, nearest airport. There are many, many variants that go into a thriving city. But the question is, it's unified the country, the way we look at cities, but it's not uniform because every city is not the same. It's not like an ERP that you prepare and box it and ship it to every city and say, install this and run the city. Whereas you create a flexible platform infrastructure that allows you to reassemble, reconfigure it for the city that we really want to do. Second one, yeah, distributing the ability to solve. A platform called Echo, which works in healthcare, is an amazing example of that, because there the idea is, how do you improve the capability of doctors and healthcare workers through the application of what is known as guided mentoring. So how do you use a technological backbone to connect doctors and help them mentor each other so that the remote doctors who are working in tertiary healthcare systems, or healthcare workers who are far from centers of excellence, are actually able to solve the problems for their patients rather than tell the patients to go back to a district hospital or to a state hospital, because those things are far, people lose wages, it is very expensive. So it's important for us to understand, how do we distribute the ability to solve the healthcare problem? And they work in tuberculosis, cancer, mental health, maternal health, and so on and so forth. And so that's an example of how you think of a platform that can distribute the ability to solve using technology infrastructure as a backbone, and the innovation and the ecosystem and network effects and all the good things you know about platforms. And the third and the last one, plus one change at the XTEP Foundation, which is where I work, and our principals, Rohini and Nandan Nilekani, are also based. We've been working on education. So how do you improve education for 200 million children? Now, one could say that we could go into curriculum, pedagogy, teacher training, so many other things. But there is one change that they chose to work upon in partnership with the Ministry of Human Resources Development, as to how do you change the teacher-child interaction when the teacher enters the class. And by using some very interesting technologies like QR code and inserting QR code into millions of books that get printed in India every day across many curricula, many languages, we were able to see how you create one small change that when you come inside the classroom, the first thing that you do changes, and it has a huge amplification effect across the entire education system. And so these are the three interesting design principles, because in the end, our quest is not to see how do we scale what works, but our quest is to see how do we make something work at scale.
Thank you for that. My last question for you is, could you give us examples of your work where technology was an accelerator as opposed to a signal in building response and agency and resilience in communities, particularly in the post-COVID period? And with that in mind, are you now thinking differently about your work since the onset of the pandemic?
When we flip the question from scaling what works to what works at scale, the real answer to that question is, I don't know. And the moment we accept that answer, the architects, the designers of the platform, then start looking for, how can I reuse? How can I reassemble? Who else has done it? How can I invite the ecosystem? And I think this lesson got amplified in the ongoing COVID pandemic, because all of a sudden, everybody said, how do we deal with this? I said, I don't know. And what we saw was a very rapid change in mindset around reuse, around reapplication of what exists, because there's not enough time to build. There are lives at stake, there are livelihoods at stake. The second interesting change we saw was the speed at which you can roll things out, because there is no time. And how do you roll out change iteratively in small steps, micro changes again and again? and iterate this, because there's no time to pause, think, plan, do measurement and evaluation studies and decide what is right. There's no time. An important aspect that came was that it really made us sit back and saying, we need to reimagine, because at this speed, at this scale, this is not sustainable. So let me give you some examples of how, and I'll continue the same examples that I gave you before. Let's look at Digit, the platform which I talked about for rapid urbanization. In a matter of 3 days, the platform's underlying technological backbone was repurposed. It was reused. It was rolled out, and it was provided in a very iterative fashion to create passes for moving people during a lockdown at scale across multiple states of India. And I think that is a very important aspect, that when you have to really recast and refactor things, such infrastructure, such platforms are extremely useful, because they are flexible, they're configurable, they're interoperable, they're created and designed for interface. Their architecture has been done very, very masterfully. And because the architecture is masterful, when you really want to put them to new use, all of a sudden, they provide you a much needed breath of air so that you can move very quickly. The Echo platform that I talked about in the context of healthcare, COVID hits, and now we have to develop thousands of healthcare professionals who can understand and deal with COVID. In a matter of few months, this platform was deployed to train 600,000 healthcare workers in India at a very, very high speed. And now, as we're rolling out vaccination, it's the same platform that has been repurposed to saying, how do we develop vaccinators? For a country like India, it is not easy to reuse our current vaccinators, because then the children will go unvaccinated. So we have to develop new vaccinators. And how do we develop hundreds of thousands of vaccinators across the network of the country? And in a matter of weeks, this platform was repurposed, reused to be able to do that. And so I think that is an important element of when suddenly things change in a situation like this, having underlying platforms that can really be reused and repurposed. The third example I gave you for education, schools got locked down. You would have seen in your respective countries as well. And it's easy for people who have access to sophisticated platforms to continue their education. But what about children in government schools who have hardly any access to content, very minimal, potentially sometimes even no access to technology? What do you do there? And so the entire education platform, which is run by the Ministry of HRD in India, called Diksha, suddenly was the center stage of how do we ensure continuity of education under such a breakdown. And then how do you, because it's interoperable, flexible as an architecture, how do you interface it with voice systems, television programs, different kinds of physical mechanisms of teaching? How do you take it out to remote and tribal and rural areas of the country? And as we speak, the platform has been able to create an environment in which about 180 plus million children could learn in the hands of more than 10 million teachers. And the platform was able to deliver more than 1 billion learning sessions to help teachers cope with this. And a similar extension of that, another platform which to help parents cope with this. So I think when we have to respond to something at this scale, and given the way things are moving and given the way we are ignoring the effects of climate, these things could happen to us in many, many different ways and repeatedly over time. The only way to build an extremely resilient society is to build such infrastructure thoughtfully, such that we can respond to short-term in stable times and very, very quickly in unstable times.
So thank you very much, Sanjay. And I think your last answer there is an excellent segue also to our next speaker in terms of how we reuse and repurpose existing platforms and capacities within society when we're faced with a crisis, and that really enables us to roll out a response at scale much quicker than we would if we had to start from scratch. So thank you very much for that, Sanjay. We're now moving on to our next panelist. who, as I mentioned, is the Honourable Minister of IT and Innovation in Rwanda, Paula Ingabire. Welcome. So Paula is here to speak to us a little bit about the experience that Rwanda has had in terms of its COVID response and how it has really leveraged the capacities and technologies that Rwanda had already put in place pre-crisis. So my first question to you, Paula, is, Rwanda, as I mentioned, really responded to COVID with some extraordinary measures, whether it was looking at pooled testing methods, to shifting to digital money, almost overnight, and also introducing robots as doctors. And of course, one can't make that or create that ability to digitally transform systems, entire sort of countrywide systems in a day. So what investments did the government make in the digital literacy prior to COVID that really created these conditions for the sort of transformative response that the country was able to put forth in the face of the pandemic earlier last year?
Thank you. Thank you for having me on this panel. First, I must start by saying some of the progress that we see in terms of how Rwanda has responded to managing and containing the COVID-19 pandemic has been thanks to the collaborative effort that has happened across various institutions, and very specifically speaking to the use of digital technologies in the containment of the COVID-19 pandemic. A lot of this could not have been possible if it wasn't for some of the investments that we had made over the last 15 to 20 years in terms of rolling out massive digital ICT infrastructure across the country, training citizens in terms of digital literacy, making sure that we are in many ways trying to ensure that every citizen is able to access services in the most convenient way possible. So all these investments that have been made over the last 20 years or so, in many ways have paid off as we grapple with the pandemic, as we try to figure out what was the best way to respond and contain the pandemic and keep the economy afloat. And as you rightly pointed out, we had to look at what were some of the best effective and efficient ways of really leveraging every resource that we have as a country in managing the pandemic. And so just like many countries where the digital transformation has been a silver lining, with every cloud there's a silver lining. And for us, just like many countries, it's been the investments in the digital infrastructure, but also the fact that digital transformation has been highlighted. Of course, it goes without saying that has also come with some of the gaps around the digital divide that have been exacerbated. But just to speak specifically to your point, our journey of digital transformation started in 2000. And during that time, we were looking at a strategy of putting in place the right institutional frameworks, liberalizing the telecommunication market, and then thinking about investing in the critical ICT infrastructure that was needed, where today we have multiple, more than 7,000 kilometers of fiber connecting every district and border point of the country. And when the pandemic hit, globally, we're already looking at some of the last mile connectivity solutions that would allow for us to continue to harness the benefits of the digital world and also to really transform into a digital economy. And so fast forward, these kind of investments are really what has paid off to date in terms of understanding how we leverage this, but also thinking about emerging technologies. And that's one point I wanted to highlight. When you look at the use of emerging technologies today, for some countries, it may be difficult to even adopt them because either lack of infrastructure, but two, the existence of legacy systems that makes it very expensive to overhaul and adopt these emerging technologies. So a country like ours, which there are no legacy systems, makes it easy to even think about leapfrogging using these emerging technologies. I think you did speak to the robots. We've also been using drones to support the containment measure. We've been using AI and data and big data analytics models that we were building to sort of project and see the spread of COVID-19 pandemic, but also help us with better planning in terms of what kind of preparedness levels we need to have in place to contain the pandemic.
thank you very much for that. And I also like how you speak about technology as, as an equalizer, and the importance then of the digital infrastructure and the last mile, and digital literacy, and really putting emphasis on digital literacy and access for all. So thank you very much for that. My second question for you is, as in your relationship with the private sector, you seem to have balanced meaningful partnerships without outsourcing critical capabilities that have ultimately made the public sector response to COVID outstanding. So in that experience, what are some of the main lessons in this approach that you can point to, particularly to countries that are looking to build these internal capacities for stewarding digital transformation? And of course, here I'm also thinking from a selfish perspective in terms of the government of Botswana that is just at the start of this process. So over to you.
That's a very good question. So even back to what I just spoke to around the vision and the journey that Rwanda has gone through as we built our digital transformation strategy, but also went about to implement it. And I did highlight many of the investments that government had made. But what is critical to note is also the partnerships that we've been able to leverage as we respond or as we implement some of these strategies that we've put in place. And that was important for us as a country because just like any other government, we're limited on resources, but the plans are ambitious. And so what's the best way to sort of, meet the targets and plans that you have ahead with such a constrained, set of resources? And I think there couldn't have been a better way than thinking about partnerships with the private sector, whether we're talking about public-private partnerships, like how the government of Rwanda has partnered with South Korea to build our 4G network, or even thinking about unlocking the necessary policy, regulatory, and business environment that is required for private investments to come in and leverage this kind of environment and supporting infrastructure and that has been put in place as a foundation. And one of these areas that we see, of course, without going into detail, you see how healthcare is one of the priority areas as a country where even as we deployed connectivity, thinking about connecting all the healthcare facilities today, last week we started our mass vaccination exercise for COVID across the country. And to see how it was made possible to collect data and record it using systems that was only possible because of the fact that many of these health facilities had already been connected and had been prioritized, but also the fact, the digital literacy aspect that I spoke to. So in terms of lessons learned, I think it was really understanding first and foremost that we couldn't do it on our own as a government. We needed partners. We needed massive resources to really fix the depth and breadth of the kind of challenges that we're dealing with as a government, but also knowing that our responsibility as government was we set the vision and direction, we sort of like create a roadmap. But most importantly, being open to, to the kind of consultations and feedback that we're not getting only from the end users, but also from some of these private partners that are so critical to, our survival, so critical to the implementation and of this vision and strategy that we've laid out. The third thing as a lesson learned is being able to put in place the right regulatory framework for private sector-led kind of initiatives. I'll just give you an example so it doesn't feel like a very broad statement. I remember when we started to look, and I did speak to emerging technologies, when Zipline first came to Rwanda and they wanted to, use drones. And initially the idea was, how do we use drones to support last mile delivery? And so we had to quickly think, where are we struggling most in terms of last mile delivery and distribution? And healthcare was one prime area because we're looking at all the health facilities and centers across the country that are in need, for example, of blood products. And these blood products cannot be delivered in real time. So we have to, spend hours transporting blood. And of course, there's wastage in the process because you need to have enough blood whenever it's needed. And so we said, let's test the use of drone technology. Now, it's important to highlight that at that point, as we were discussing with Zipline as a private partner who was coming, a US-based firm, there were no regulations that were agreed on globally around drone regulations. And so even how shared airspace can be done, the sharing of airspace can be managed. And so what we then agreed was, we're happy, we want to use these drones, we want to see how much time saving, cost saving, and efficiency and productivity that it generates for us. But here are the concerns that we have around the unavailability of regulations that we can even benchmark as best practices. And that really is what bore what today we call performance-based regulations that we've done together with the World Economic Forum that many countries have today adopted. And the idea is that rather than constrain the adoption of these emerging technologies because we don't have a regulatory environment or pieces of legislation that are conducive to support that deployment, we would much rather say, here are the risks that we anticipate, and then jointly work towards how do we implement some of these proof of concepts while minimizing the risks, but also understanding the kind of regulations that need to be put in place. And I think that is really a critical piece of being able to build an innovation, kind of ecosystem. And lastly, I think it's really the transparency and clarity in processes and accountability. I think when you're dealing with so much uncertainty, transparency definitely helps in really unlocking the opportunities for partnership that many of our partners will come as they seek to support us. Finally, I think in terms of what should countries do, I think first and foremost is really to understand that when you're dealing in a tech sector, it's learning is continuous. So yes, we may want to build internal capacities, but how agile do we build a workforce that is agile enough to adapt to the changing needs and demands that we have? One of the things that we're currently looking at, for example, is a policy lab concept that we've instituted here in the ministry that is really focused on how do we build capabilities for our own, digital transformation teams, so that they're able to respond in an agile, flexible, relevant manner to the challenges that we deal with on a day-to-day basis.
Okay, thank you very much, Paola, for these insights. And I think it's clear that Rwanda really is at the forefront of pushing for digital transformation and inviting for collaboration with the private sector. My third question builds on this also, is in terms of governments and large bureaucracies, much like also UNDP, we're often slow to adapt to change. So what can you point to successful approaches in breaking that resistance when it comes to internal digital transformation and a shift of Rwanda's public sector towards becoming the sort of digital native?
So I think maybe a starting point is that bureaucracies probably exist everywhere. And whether it's governments or even in the corporate world, they may be of a different, outfit or nature and scale, but I think they do exist everywhere. I think we tend to see that a lot as we, think about how digital technologies can support in delivering on one's mission and vision ultimately. And so you still tend to see even from the corporate world, some companies lagging behind than those that have actually embraced the need to have a digital first strategy. But to your point, I think the very starting bit of breaking that kind of resistance is even from the top leadership, really embracing and understanding that this is going to be part and parcel of vision, mission, but also, the values that we create within an organization. And that has been natural for Rwanda because from the top leadership, led by our president, as someone who's a strong advocate for digital technologies and transformation and the role it can do in supporting a country like ours that has limited natural resources, but also the potential it has to uplift many economies out of poverty, is really something that if it wasn't for that kind of vision that the president had, it would be difficult to sort of this to trickle down to even the lowest levels of administration. So I think the first very first approach I would quickly think of, and even just reflecting on our story as a country, is what's the buy-in for the top leadership. So for governments, it will be the head of government, and for corporates, of course, the CEO, whatever the titles are out there. And so that is very important to start with. Then the second thing is mainstreaming digital transformation across the board. I think the tendency that we see when it comes to technology is feeling like this is another siloed aspect of whether it's part of a government strategy or even a corporate strategy. So how do you mainstream it? How do you, the same way we mainstream, gender priorities, can digital, the digital transformation or the use of digital tools be mainstreamed in everything that is done, and everyone understanding that, thinking about digital technologies, unlocking opportunities and challenges is not an afterthought when you've tried and tested other means and it's not working, but it should be a natural thing that, a natural go-to step in terms of trying to understand how a digital technology is going to help us, because really when you look at the future, it's all going to be digital. And for us, and when I talk about mainstreaming, to give you an example for Rwanda, for us to do that, what we've done initially, we had IT teams and units within organizations that are supporting the day-to-day operations of these government institutions. But then when we shifted from just support to thinking of ourselves as enablers, as technology as a tool for enabling or supporting the vision, enabling the realization of a mission, it called for us to put in place what we call chief digital officers in every sector, which are crucial for not just mainstreaming, but for consolidating and coordinating what is happening across the sector, but also shifting from IT or ICT or digital technologies just seen as support tools, but rather thinking about this data-driven approach to policy making that we want to use, to the data-driven approach to implementation will never be possible if we don't have the right teams in place that are already thinking about, when I digitize a process, when I digitize different data sets, it's not just a question of going digital, but it's also the value of the data that is being created that can be used to feed back into decision making. So for us, and we're starting to see the benefits of that, having these chief digital officers that are now shifting away from IT support, as you can think of it literally, to now thinking about what value are we creating, the data that we're that we have at our disposal, how is it being used to inform the policies that government is putting in place, the regulations or the implementation that is being done. And finally, I think it's really, when we talk about mainstreaming, it's the ability to innovate from within. I think that also breaks away the resistance. So it stops to be, someone else has come and is informing you of what digital transformation measures need to be put in place, but it becomes part and parcel of the deliverables that within you have a team that is guiding the development of innovation, the development of strategies that are leveraging digital technologies to respond to the core mission. So, and I think those things have worked for us in many ways as we shifted, our lens into thinking about how do we fully go digital, by really creating those kind of synergies by integrating teams within these government institutions that feed back to the overall ICT strategy that we have created as a government. But most importantly, like I said at the beginning, this wouldn't have been possible if there wasn't buy-in from the top leadership.
So thank you very much, Paula, for this. And with this, we'll move on to our third panelist, Tomás Diaz, who is the Fab Lab director in Barcelona. He is the founder of Fab City Foundation in Estonia and also globally. And he is the founding member of Meaningful Design Group in Bali. And Tomás Diaz really speaks to us about the notion of the distributed power of technology and how through that power we can build more resilient citizens and reshape our notion of value creation in that sort of disrupts our understanding of the Western industrial and sort of consumerism-based models. So welcome, Tomás. My first question to you is really around this sort of moment of convergence that is characterized by the democratization of production of goods. Due to the evolution of these platform-enabled ecosystems, what do you think will be the impact of heightened risk factors, such as the COVID outbreak or any other sort of global shocks, on these transformations that we are starting to witness?
So yeah, as you say, we are in a moment of convergence. I believe that it's a convergence of multiple crises, and at the same time, we are in a technological convergence as well. And this is something that we have seen before in the history of humanity. You can call the beginning of the 20th century, or even 500 years ago as well, with the the beginning of globalization. I think that this moment of convergence is a little bit different. As you said, we are having access to tools as we never had before, but at the same time, these tools are turning against us in some way. So one of the critical things that I believe we need to really think about our future is how we're going to use this access to tools. The problem is that when digital tools turns against you, like what is happening with information, for instance. We are having information obesity. There is too much information in the world, and when you are not able to critically analyze it and select what is good, what is bad, what it makes sense, what it doesn't make sense, what has meaning for you and what doesn't, then it can really turn against you. It becomes more dangerous when we think about the upcoming revolution in fabrication. And this is what we call the third digital revolution. It means that, right now we have supercomputers in our pockets that are hyper-connected globally. But then we are starting to have computers connected to machines that allow us to turn digital information into objects that they can perform in the reality, in the physical reality. For me, it's fundamental to provide the right framework in order for these tools, these new digital tools that are emerging, not to be in the hands of only few people, but be in the hands of as many people as possible. So we advocate completely for the defense of open source tools and open source knowledge around the world, as well as set up a very strong agenda dedicated to the digital literacy around the world. We have seen that the digital divide has increased. I believe that the digital divide is not just about having access or not to digital technologies, but it's how you use them. And that's why we're using supercomputers that can allow us, go to the moon, and that we're using it for very simple actions as consumers. So we have become producers of content. We have become producers and photographers and musicians and journalists. So the world is in the tips of our fingers. When we translate that power into the capacity of creating our own reality, in designing and making the reality around us, I think it's fundamental that access to tools is a human right, as well as access to the knowledge to use these tools, and lastly, defend the right for people to have open source access to the knowledge produced in the digital world.
So thank you very much for those important insights. My second question to you is, in the context of Fab Lab, can we really expect that the evolution of the economy, as you're studying it with Fab City, will we really bring about this Fab citizen, this resilient citizen who's essentially almost self-sufficient? And what would this imply in terms of the universalizing role of technology, of connecting the globe as a whole?
Sure. I mean, with the race of uncertainty that we have today, right? You mentioned before that right now we live in a moment of different convergences, right? The uncertainty that is generating the current events in the world. Now we are seeing the tip of the iceberg with the global pandemic. We are not more and more we are going to be unable to predict what's going to happen. We are affecting the climate, and it's going to change very rapidly. So it means that we need to be more resilient to these transformations, and also to adopt different principles to design, to manufacturing, and also to the fundamental reasons from which we put something into existence into the world. From Fab Labs, what we have been trying to do is democratize the access to the means of production. Fab Labs are small fabrication laboratories. There are over 2,000 Fab Labs located in almost any country that you can imagine in the world, from Bhutan to South Africa, from Los Angeles to Tokyo, right? These Fab Labs give the potential for people to acquire the knowledge on how to use digital fabrication technologies in order to create, not only to replicate the reality as it is, but also to be able to create new technologies, new tools that allow citizens and inhabitants, not only people from the cities, but also people from the rural areas, to be able to create their own technology. That means that, from thinking about making products, we can start to think about creating the tools that we need in order not only to make just a chair or just to make a coffee cup, but thinking about how we create, for instance, the machines that exist inside a Fab Lab. So that's part of our research roadmap, is to think about how a Fab Lab can make another Fab Lab, how we can open source the making of digital fabrication machines so people can make their own machines and are able to modify and customize these machines depending on the materials that are around them, the materials that are located with their bioregional systems, and they are not only depending on standardized materials around the world. But it's, from machines, we can also think about how citizens can produce the means to produce energy in their city, or produce the means, produce the technologies to produce food in their cities, or to filter water, or to create the alternative internet networks that we have seen in many projects around the world. So in this way, you can start to think about the citizen as a producer and not only as a consumer. And this is a fundamental shift, a paradigm shift from the industrial society that is based on centralized production, access to materials, access to labor, access to sources of energy that are concentrated. This means that the main driver for keeping this all industrial model is now the economic growth, because it's the sense making that is behind all the accumulation of the means of production in the hands of few corporations worldwide. But when you think about the potential of distributed production, that instead of having cheap access to raw materials in zones under conflicts, like in Africa or in South America, as we see all the geopolitics behind the control of the lithium or the aluminum or the coltan is huge. And you translate it with the capacity to control sources of energy, the control of oil. I am from Venezuela, what can I say? And then also the fundamental food safety challenges that we're going to have in the future. Is kind of, it can be scary about if we start to think that all these resources are going to be following the same principles of our old capitalism. So citizens empowered with new knowledge about creating technology is just one small step, but we need to follow these efforts on rethinking the type of infrastructure that is needed in the 21st century. If you think about in the 23rd century, the type of investment in infrastructure has been mainly about the movement of atoms and the standardized production. So the 21st century, from the work that we're doing in Fab Labs and also in the Fab City Global Initiative, should be focused on developing distributed infrastructures for infrastructure for distributed production. That means that we relocalize production and we make it closer to consumption. That means that we give regions, cities, towns, rural towns, the capacity to be more resilient, to produce locally the energy, the food, the products that they need, and more importantly, connected with their bioregional reality, with the natural systems around them. And in order to do that, we need to promote a global effort that should go It should be hand in hand with the promotion, not only of this infrastructure, but also to the access of knowledge in how to use the novel infrastructure that are going to allow us to create fundamentally a new economic model and a new society if we want to keep inhabiting this planet.
So thank you very, very much for these insights. I'm sure that it has yielded a lot of questions and curiosities in the audience, which we will get to in our Q&A session. But before we move to that, we have one last panelist, who is Sue Cahombo Stefano. And she, as I mentioned, is the founder and director of Green Dreams and Green Dreams Tech in Kenya, where she runs this social enterprise leveraging technology to empower small-scale farmers. So my first question to you, Sue, is what is the most fundamental change that your work has helped create in the lives of these small-scale farmers?
So we've built a digital agricultural ecosystem for smallholder farmers that's accessible over low-end phones. That's called iCow. And it focuses on all areas of dynamic smallholder systems, and it's available for free to farmers 24/7. iCow provides education on climate-smart practices, networks of experts and markets, as you said. It connects rural smallholder farmers with cutting-edge science and research. It also allows farmers to input their records into big data systems where they receive instant analytics and feedback via SMS, which, if executed, result in improved productivity and profitability. And we've worked with the best agricultural livestock institutions in the world, using a variety of technologies to bridge the digital divide and create conditions and place for smallholder farmers at the global table. In the end, our value to farmers is that we create the environments, tools, and the networks for them to become successful.
Thank you very much, Sue. And I can see that your work is really having an enormous impact on the people that you touch through your social enterprise. My second question to you is that there used to be this big buzz around apps and hackathons in solving some of the world's big problems. But there's increasingly more evidence that this seems to be more hype than tangible evidence or of success or change, or what Sanjay was talking about in terms of, we often look at small scale pilots and then we look at how can we scale these pilots that we think are successful, as opposed to looking at these sort of +1 iterative design process where you take one element and then you implement across the system, and so that you scale what works. What makes iCow different from this? What makes you confident that it works?
So, well, iCow won the first Apps for Africa hackathon in 2020. So I'm not going to bash hackathons, but here's the thing. We didn't enter the hackathon to develop iCow. We entered part of our solution we were building into a hackathon. And at that time, I didn't have a clue what a hackathon was. But being competitive, it seemed an interesting thing to do. Apps generally are available on smart devices. We, however, were building for farmers who didn't have smart devices. We were building for low-end phones. In the end, iCow isn't really an app. iCow's a platform. Low-end phone solutions are generally based on USSD and SMS systems. And development, access, and sustainability are very different when building, for example, or even using an app. And apart from the technical build, to sustainably and cost-effectively roll out a low-end phone solution, one depends on partnerships. And our partnership with Safaricom, the biggest telco in our region, has helped us ensure we can deliver our services to our end users in a timely and sustainable manner. But on top of that, subject matter expertise and passion are hugely important assets for any solution to be successful, whether it's an app or whether it's a platform. And as a farmer myself, my role in the company is to take our learnings from the field and turn them into solutions we can deliver over SMS and USSD. Our customer care team engages with farmers on a day-to-day basis, virtually, by phone, and we spend hours later innovating and testing ideas with small groups of farmers before we release the ideas or the solutions to our entire database of users. And I want to give you an example here. An example about the body condition scoring tool we're currently building. For a virtual organization like ours to help at a micro level in the field without eyes on the ground, we need to be extremely agile and innovative. The body condition scoring tool is a method to assess the body condition of an animal. It's used globally by livestock keepers, and it measures the state and condition based on 5 indicator bones of an animal. Here's my cow. It measures the spine, the short ribs, the long ribs, the pin bones, and the hook bones of an animal with a cow. And basically the measurements are looking at the different fat and skin coverage over these bones on the animal. Now, when we're trying to help a farmer assess an animal in the field, we can't see the animal. So we've had to design a tool that they can use to give us a virtual perception of what their animal actually looks like. And the way we've done it is like this. We selected a group of farmers to help us build the test product. And we did this by SMS. We sent a whole bunch of farmers an SMS and said, do you want to help us be part of this research? And those have answered. We then sent them 6 messages, 6 SMSs that with detailed instructions on how to assess their cows. The instructions required that they face the cow on the side and they put their hand on the back of the cow, that's the spine, and then they move their hand forward to the short ribs. Anyway, we got them to walk through the process, but to draw their cow on a piece of paper, and then to take a photograph of it with a friend of theirs who may have a smartphone and WhatsApp the picture to us. What we wanted to see is, are all the farmers indicating and recognizing from our description the same bones? And we continue to iterate on this and the wording that we used in this until we have about 90% of the farmers all actually accessing the right bones. And from here, we built a USSD pathway that's like using the menu on feature phones to actually go in there and score the bones. So farmers get information now based on the trials we've done with farmers. We're able to release this to farmers all over the country, and they can go in and give us a virtual perception of the cow based on this very, very farmer-centric way that we developed this tool. And then based on that, that one point, that data point of the cow's body condition scoring, plus their milk records, where they are in their lactation, whether they're pregnant, the age of the animal, etc. Then working with partners and big data, we're able to actually see the animal in a more virtual way, and then give farmers targeted information to make sure that they optimize the production of that animal and breed her appropriately according to their production systems. So my point here being to deliver transformational products at scale to communities on the other side of the digital divide, apart from deep subject matter and expertise, one needs to develop partnerships and ecosystems for any solution to be successful, whether it's delivered to an end user through an app or a platform. At the end of the day, technology is really merely a conduit.
Thank you, Sue, for these insights on iCow and the transformative power that it has. My last question to you is: how has COVID affected the farmers that you work with? How has the network and intelligence they can access via iCow affected their ability to work and produce? And have you seen some sort of non-obvious ways in which the farmers coped with the implications of COVID as a result of this?
Yeah, COVID is a big one, isn't it? So early on, we began to see, as our country put in restrictions around COVID, and these included curfews, they included stay-at-homes, schools were closed, businesses were closed, restaurants were closed. And many smallholder farmers actually supply these outlets and are used to children being out of school. So when these restrictions were put in around COVID, these hygiene restrictions, etc., what we began to see is farmers started running out of food at home. There was more consumption at home. There were more people at home all the time at home. We began to see that farmers started saying to us, look, we've got problems. We can't do this. We can't feed our animals. we don't have enough money to buy certain inputs for our crops or for our animals, even food for our families. So we did three things. The first thing is we started a Farmers Angel program where we invited people to contribute using World Remit, $10 a week to farming communities that we had vetted on the ground. And we actually chose women farmers, and women farmers actually that had children, many children or children, and in the case of three of them, they had children that were in wheelchairs. And then we basically drip fed $10 a week to those families to let them at least purchase food. The other thing that we did is, knowing that the farmers were impacted on it, that financially their first concerns were going to be their family, we began to realize that their big assets, their livestock assets, were going to begin suffering as well. So collectively, again, with partners, with the telco and with other partners, we put together what we called a Mifugo extension service. Mifugo in Swahili means livestock. And this was a toll-free number manned by 15, they were actually vets, but they were providing animal husbandry services. So manned with those, the telco gave us the phones, we put the phones in the field, we got our team trained the extension service providers on how to update the data they were getting from farmers into another tool so that we could look at the dashboards and see what was happening in the field. And then we rolled it out. We sent messages to farmers saying, look, if you've got problems with your animals, call these extension agents. It's free, it's a toll-free number. And the information we started getting about, I mean, in 3 months, we got 30,000 calls. We couldn't manage them. And it has spurred us now to actually start building other tools on the system to help actually do a more automated response, because we can see that there is a big demand there, and this is not going away. It's still there. On a weekly basis, farmers do have to do certain things to keep their animals safe. For example, with cows, they're expected to spray them every week. If you don't have money to spray them, then they're subject to tick-borne diseases, and this can be quite critical in terms of their productivity and even life. And once you have animals that are impacted on, actually whether it's even poultry or larger animals like cows or even goats or sheep, it takes a long time for them to recover. So we're trying to backstop the livestock perspective and to make sure that we've got some kind of system in place to help that. And then the other thing we did now more on the human side, on the farmer family side, was we changed our menu entirely from the normal iCow menu to what we call the COVID menu, so that when farmers dialed our short code, the first things they came across were information on COVID, so they could go in and tap into whatever information they wanted, and they would receive that information in SMSs that they could read. There's information on hygiene, it was information on the latest, actually the CDC regulations, etc. And then we also built in a national hotline system, so that farmers all over the country could go in based on the menu again, select their area that they lived in, select their village, and they would then receive SMSs with the experts, the COVID experts on the ground in their locations that they could call if they needed any help. And we're seeing that those tools are all being used. Kenya is currently going through what it appears to be the third wave third COVID wave in the country, transmission, or whatever the virus, which is quite scary. And we imagine that as you see the wave going, you also see in the back end data the usage of those tools we built in going. We have our ear on the ground all the time with farmers, and if we see that there is any need for anything else, we will also innovate and see what else we can support them with in this area.
So there's a lot of food for thought here. And thank you very much to all the panelists for taking the time and for sharing your knowledge and insights and also inspirations with us. So we hope that the conversation has provoked a lot of questions and reactions also in the audience. And this is where we're turning now to our next Q&A session. So thank you again to our panelists, and we'll now open for Q&A from the audience.